Eliza sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the framed picture of her family on the wall. Her twin sister Anna smiled brightly next to their parents, her perfect smile and impeccable posture reflecting the life everyone expected them to lead. Eliza's face, however, was slightly out of focus in the corner of the picture, an almost imperceptible but undeniable symbol of her existence as the shadow of her family's perfection. From a young age, Eliza had always felt the pressure to conform to her family's expectations. Her parents, especially her father, had big dreams for her, a life of success, prestige, and admiration. But as time went on, Eliza's desire to carve out her own path only grew stronger, while Anna effortlessly fulfilled the role of the golden child, excelling in school, securing a prestigious career, and now preparing for her engagement to a successful lawyer. Eliza felt like an outsider. No matter how hard she tried, she could never live up to the standards they had set for her. Each family dinner felt like a performance. Anna would recount her latest accomplishments, her engagement, her upcoming move to a luxury apartment in the city. Eliza, on the other hand, often felt lost for words, knowing her parents would never understand her dreams. Every conversation seemed to circle back to Anna's achievements, making Eliza feel smaller and smaller. One evening, after yet another dinner that left her feeling invisible, Eliza found herself walking out of the house. She needed air. She needed space. She needed freedom. As she wandered through the quiet streets of the neighborhood, she couldn't shake the feeling of suffocation. The weight of her family's expectations hung over her like a storm cloud, and it felt like there was no escape. She had always been a dreamer, but in her family, there was no room for dreams, only carefully planned futures and endless pressure to succeed. The next day, as she sat at the kitchen table, her parents began their usual lecture about her future. They had already lined up a promising job at a prestigious law firm for her, an opportunity Anna had helped secure. But Eliza wasn't interested. She didn't want that life. She didn't want to be part of their perfect world anymore. When her father asked her, in a stern voice, why she was being so difficult, something inside her snapped. "Because I'm not you, and I'm not Anna," she said, the words leaving her lips before she could stop them. "I don't want your life. I want to find my own path." Her mother's eyes widened in shock, and her father's face darkened. "What are you saying?" he asked coldly. "Do you think you're above this family? Above the opportunities we've given you?" Eliza felt the familiar sting of their disapproval, but refused to back down. "I'm not like Anna. I don't want everything you've planned for me. I want to live my own life." The silence in the room was deafening. Her parents exchanged a look, one that spoke volumes. They were disappointed, angry, and perhaps even embarrassed. But Eliza didn't care anymore. She was tired of pretending, tired of living in their shadow. As her parents tried to reason with her, Eliza stood up. "I'm done," she said quietly. "I don't want this life. I'm leaving." And just like that, Eliza made her decision. She didn't know where she would go or what she would do, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't stay in this suffocating world any longer. It was time to break free. Her heart raced as she left the house, stepping into the unknown. The weight of her family's expectations lifted, but it was replaced by a new feeling, the excitement of possibility. For the first time in years, Eliza felt like she was in control of her own future. As she walked away, her thoughts turned to a chance meeting she'd had a few days earlier. She had met Jake, a welder with an adventurous spirit and a carefree attitude. Their brief conversation had sparked something in her, a sense of freedom she had longed for but never knew how to reach. Perhaps with Jake, she could finally start the life she always dreamed of. The days following Eliza's decision felt like a blur. The weight of her departure from her family hung heavy in the air, but the relief she felt from finally being free kept her moving forward. She didn't have a clear plan, but she knew she couldn't go back. She had chosen to live for herself, even if that meant facing the unknown. Her first stop was a small, bustling cafe in town, a place she used to visit when she needed a moment of peace, away from the chaos of her home life. She sat at a corner table, the quiet hum of the cafe offering a sense of comfort amidst the storm of emotions swirling inside her. The decision to leave had been both liberating and terrifying, but now, as she looked around at the people going about their day, she felt a small sense of hope. There was a world out there beyond her family's expectations, and she was finally ready to explore it. That's when she saw him. Jake was sitting at the counter, engrossed in a conversation with the barista. His rugged appearance, with a leather jacket and a faint hint of grease on his hands, immediately caught her attention. There was something about him, something different from the polished world of her family, that intrigued her. He seemed so free, unburdened by the rules that had always governed Eliza's life. As he turned, their eyes met briefly, and for a moment, Eliza felt a flicker of recognition. It wasn't that she knew him. It was the way he carried himself. Jake didn't need approval from anyone, and that was a rarity in Eliza's world. Feeling a surge of courage, she stood up and walked over to him. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice tentative but steady. Jake looked up, his expression warm and welcoming. "Not at all," he said with a grin, motioning to the empty seat next to him. Eliza sat down, and they exchanged introductions. Jake was a welder, passionate about his craft and living a life free from the constraints of society's expectations. As they talked, Eliza found herself drawn to his carefree attitude, the way he spoke about his work and the simple joys of life. He was everything Eliza had been craving, a life of freedom, of living in the moment without the weight of others' opinions. For the first time in a long while, Eliza felt at ease. She shared her frustrations about her family and the constant pressure to be someone she wasn't. Jake listened without judgment, offering a sense of understanding that Eliza had never experienced before. It felt good to be seen, not as the daughter of her parents, but as herself. Over the next few days, Eliza found herself returning to the cafe to see Jake, their conversations growing longer and more intimate. She learned that Jake had grown up in a small town, far removed from the world of privilege Eliza had known. He had never cared about fitting into society's mold. He had built his life on his own terms, finding happiness in the work he loved. One afternoon, as they sat outside the cafe, Jake asked her, "So, what's your dream, Eliza? What do you want out of life?" Eliza hesitated. For so long, her dreams had been overshadowed by her parents' vision for her future. But now, with Jake by her side, she felt the weight of that question lift. For the first time, she realized she had the power to decide for herself. "I don't know," she admitted, a smile tugging at her lips. "But I think I'm ready to find out." Jake grinned, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "Well, you've already taken the first step. Now it's time to go after it." His words resonated deeply with Eliza. She had spent so much of her life trying to meet the expectations of others. But now, she was ready to break free from the life she'd been forced into. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, in years, Eliza felt excited about what lay ahead. As the days turned into weeks, Eliza's bond with Jake grew stronger. Their relationship was simple, yet full of possibilities. He was everything she needed. Someone who understood her desire for freedom. Someone who didn't see her as a daughter of wealthy parents, but as a person with her own dreams and ambitions. But despite the happiness she found in her new life, Eliza couldn't escape the nagging feeling that her family would never accept her choices. The pressure from her parents was still there, lurking in the background. They hadn't given up on trying to mold her into the perfect daughter. Eliza knew that soon she would have to make a decision, a choice between the life she had always known and the one she was building with Jake. It was a choice she wasn't ready to make just yet, but she could feel it coming, and when it arrived, she knew it would be the hardest decision of her life. For now, though, Eliza was content. She had broken free from her family's expectations, and with Jake by her side, she was starting to build a life that was truly her own. The pressure from Eliza's family never truly disappeared. As the days went on, their disapproval lingered, subtly creeping into her thoughts. Her parents, accustomed to having control over every aspect of her life, hadn't given up on trying to pull her back into their world. They still sent her texts, called her almost every day, and occasionally showed up at the cafe where she met Jake, hoping for a conversation that would bring her back to the fold. But Eliza wasn't interested in their world anymore. It was Anna's engagement that pushed things over the edge. Her twin sister's perfect life was everything their parents had always dreamed for both of them. Anna, with her flawless grades, her polished personality, and now a proposal from a wealthy, highly successful lawyer. She was everything Eliza was expected to be. The engagement announcement, complete with a lavish dinner hosted by their parents, was a public spectacle, a reminder of everything Eliza had rejected. Eliza didn't attend the dinner. She didn't even tell her parents why she wouldn't be there. They were furious, but she didn't care. The more they pushed, the more Eliza wanted to distance herself from their world. She could never live up to their ideal, so why should she try? The tension between Eliza and her family had reached its peak. Her father, always the one to impose his authority, was growing increasingly irritable. Her mother, too, had lost her gentle, pleading tone and started to sound more demanding. Their repeated attempts to convince her to see reason were wearing on her, and their efforts to persuade her to follow Anna's path grew more insistent. One day, they sent her an ultimatum. They demanded that she come to a family gathering, where they had arranged a meeting with a potential suitor, someone they believed would understand her, someone who could lead her back to the life they'd always envisioned for her. Eliza, who had been steadily growing more confident in her choices, was done with their manipulation. But she also knew that saying no wouldn't be enough anymore. It was time to confront her family. She invited Jake over to her apartment that evening, knowing she'd need his support. As they sat on the couch, he reached over and took her hand, sensing the storm building within her. "You don't have to. Go back to them, Eliza," he said softly. "I know it's hard, but this life, your life, is yours. They can't control it anymore." Eliza looked at him, her heart full of both gratitude and fear. "But they'll never stop pushing. They want me to be someone I'm not. I can't keep living under their expectations, but I don't know how to make them stop." Jake squeezed her hand. "You don't owe them anything. It's your life. They'll have to accept it eventually." The next morning, Eliza took the call from her mother, who was, as usual, pleading with her to return to the family. But this time, Eliza's voice was firm, a contrast to the doubt that had once plagued her. "I'm not coming to the dinner," Eliza said. "And I won't meet this suitor you've found. I've made my choice." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before her mother spoke again. "You're throwing everything away. For what? A life with nothing?" Eliza felt the sting of her words, but she stood her ground. "I'm throwing away your dream for me, not my life. I'm choosing my own path. You might not understand, but it's my choice, and I'm not going to let you make it for me anymore." Her mother's voice cracked with frustration, but Eliza didn't wait for another attempt to change her mind. She hung up the phone, her hands shaking slightly, but her resolve stronger than ever. That afternoon, she left the apartment to clear her mind. She needed to process the weight of what she'd just done. Walking through the city streets, she felt an unfamiliar sense of freedom washing over her. Freedom from the expectations, the guilt, the sense of obligation. But it didn't last long. As she rounded the corner, she found herself face to face with Anna. Her twin sister, now glowing with her engagement ring, stood there with a mix of surprise and concern in her eyes. "Eliza," Anna said softly, her voice cautious. "I heard what happened. Mum and Dad they're devastated. You can't just throw everything away. Eliza felt a mix of anger and sadness. It's not throwing anything away, Anna. It's choosing something for myself. I'm not going to live the life they've planned for me. I don't want the same things you do. I'm not you. Anna's eyes narrowed, but there was no judgment in her gaze, just the shock of someone who didn't understand. You're making a mistake, Eliza shook her head. No. I'm making the right choice for me, and maybe you'll understand that one day. Anna said nothing else. She simply stared at her sister, the distance between them now undeniable. But Eliza wasn't looking back anymore. She had made her decision, and for the first time, she felt confident in it. Later that evening, Jake came over. He looked at Eliza with a warm smile, sensing the weight that had been lifted from her shoulders. How'd it go? I'm free, Eliza said quietly, her voice full of resolve. For the first time in my life, I'm free. And with that, Eliza knew there was no turning back. The life she had always been told she should want was gone. In its place, there was a world full of possibilities, a world she was finally ready to explore. Eliza had made her choice. She had stood up to her parents, rejected their demands, and walked away from the life they had planned for her. It was a bold move, but it was also one that left her with more uncertainty than she cared to admit. Jake had supported her every step of the way, but their financial situation was far from ideal, and the reality of building a life outside of her family's wealth and influence hit harder than she had expected. For the first time, Eliza had to face the practicalities of independence. No more luxurious shopping sprees or fancy dinners, no more family vacations or weekend getaways. She and Jake rented a modest apartment, their savings quickly dwindling as they tried to adjust to their new life. They lived simply, and every decision was calculated. There was no room for mistakes, no cushion to fall back on. Jake, with his skill as a welder, was working long hours, taking on jobs wherever he could to keep them afloat. Eliza, too, searched for work, but her lack of a college degree and the shadow of her family's expectations still lingered. It was a tough reality, but one that she was determined to face head-on. Despite the challenges, there was something liberating about their struggle. Every small victory felt like a triumph. A warm meal on the table, a paycheck coming through the door, and the simple joy of being with someone who loved her for who she was, not who she was expected to be. But the world outside was still pressing in on them. As Jake's welding business grew, he began to gain recognition in the local community. He secured larger contracts, and their financial situation started to stabilize. Eliza, while proud of Jake, couldn't shake the feeling that their new life wasn't enough to fully escape her past. She had left behind the perfect future her parents had mapped out for her. But her old life was never too far away. Their success was theirs alone. But the tension between the life she had chosen and the one her family wanted for her still simmered, just beneath the surface. One afternoon, while Eliza was at a local coffee shop working on some freelance projects, she received a phone call from an unknown number. When she answered, the voice on the other end was instantly recognizable. Her father, Eliza. His voice was strained, a mix of urgency and hesitation. There's something you need to know. Eliza's heart skipped a beat. The last time they had spoken, she had been resolute in her decision. She had cut ties, and yet here he was, breaking the silence. What is it? Eliza asked, keeping her voice calm, though she could feel the anger bubbling inside. She didn't want to hear from him, not after everything. It's about your mother, he said, the words carrying a weight that Eliza wasn't prepared for. She's been diagnosed with cancer. It's serious. Eliza stood up from the table, her hand gripping the edge of the chair. How serious? She asked, her voice shaking. We're still waiting on test results, but it's bad, Eliza. She might not have much time. There was a long silence on both ends of the line. Eliza's mind raced. She had left that life behind, built something new with Jake. But hearing this, hearing that her mother, The woman who had always pushed her to be perfect was sick, shook her to her core. After a moment, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what you expect me to do. Her father sighed, a sound filled with exhaustion. I need you here, Eliza. Your mother needs you. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on her. She had spent so long running away from her past, from her family's expectations, and now here it was again, crashing into her life like a tidal wave. But Eliza knew what she had to do. I'll come, she said quietly, but I'm doing this for her, not for you. With that, she ended the call, her mind racing with emotions she couldn't quite process. She looked out the window, the weight of the decision pressing on her chest. Jake was working late. So, she had the apartment to herself, but her thoughts were anything but solitary. Eliza knew this would change everything. She had made a life for herself, but her family had just made their reappearance, and with it, a whole new set of challenges. She wasn't sure what the future would look like now, how she would balance this new reality with the life she had fought so hard to build. But she knew one thing for sure. She wouldn't let her parents control her anymore. They had broken her once, but now she was strong enough to face them on her own terms. She just didn't know if she was ready for what was coming next. The following days were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Eliza couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty as she prepared to face her family again. She had spent months building a new life with Jake, and now it seemed like everything she had fought for was being called into question. The world she had carefully created was colliding with the one she had left behind. Jake could see the toll it was taking on her. He had been her rock, offering comfort and support without hesitation. But this time, even he was unsure how to navigate the situation. He knew that Eliza was strong, but he also knew how deeply the ties to her family had shaped her, and how painful it would be to face them once more. You don't have to go, Jake said one evening, his voice soft yet firm. Whatever they want, you don't owe them anything. Eliza stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. The idea of returning to her family, to that world of expectations and control, filled her with dread. But deep down, she knew she had to go. It wasn't just about her mother's illness. It was about closure, about facing the ghosts of her past and putting them to rest. I have to, Jake, she said, her voice steady, but laced with uncertainty. This isn't just about her being sick. I need to see them, to know where I stand. I need to know if I can finally move on. Jake didn't argue. He understood, though it didn't make it any easier. He kissed her forehead and gave her a long embrace, wishing her strength for what lay ahead. The drive to her parents' house felt like a lifetime. The familiar streets, the grand house she had once called home, loomed ahead, but it felt foreign to her now. She had never felt so out of place in a place that had once defined her. As she stepped out of the car, the weight of her decision was heavier than ever. Her parents had never wanted her to leave, but now they seemed to be silently waiting for her return, for some sense of redemption. When Eliza walked through the front door, her mother was sitting in the living room, her face pale and worn from the illness that had claimed so much of her strength. Her father stood by the fireplace, a shadow of the man he once was, his posture rigid but his eyes soft with unspoken regret. Eliza, her mother whispered, her voice weak but filled with a desperate longing. I'm so glad you came. The words should have offered comfort, but instead they felt like a betrayal of everything Eliza had fought to escape. She held her ground, not allowing herself to be swallowed by the guilt her mother's frail form stirred in her. How are you? Eliza asked, her voice distant. Her mother smiled weakly, but it didn't reach her eyes. It's hard, but I'm still here. The room was thick with tension, and Eliza could feel it tightening around her chest. Her father was watching her closely, his eyes filled with expectation, as if waiting for some form of apology or reconciliation. But Eliza had nothing to apologize for. She had done nothing wrong by walking away from their life. "I'm not here to pretend like things are fine," Eliza said, her voice calm but firm. "I came because you're my family, and I'm not heartless. But that doesn't mean I'm going to just forget what happened." Her father opened his mouth to speak, but Eliza held up a hand, silencing him. "I'm sorry about what you're going through, Mum," she said quietly. "But I can't pretend like I'm here for anything. Other than that, the truth was out now. The family she had once wanted to please, to belong to, had hurt her in ways she could never forget. And yet, seeing her mother so vulnerable stirred a feeling Eliza wasn't prepared for. She had always longed for her parents' approval, but now she realized that no matter what, it would never be enough. Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "Eliza, please. I've made mistakes. We all have. But I just want us to be a family again." Eliza's heart ached as she looked at the woman who had tried to shape her life, but she remained resolute. "I've moved on. I've built something for myself, and I'm not going to let my past define me anymore." There was a long silence as her father, finally speaking, muttered, "You were always the difficult one, Eliza, always fighting against what was best for you." His words stung, but Eliza didn't flinch. She had heard them too many times before. It wasn't about being difficult. It was about finding her own way, away from their suffocating control. "I'm not difficult," she said evenly. "I'm just not you." The finality of her words hung in the air. There was no going back from this. She wasn't going to let their guilt or her mother's illness pull her back into their world. As Eliza stood to leave, her mother called out to her, "Please, Eliza, don't shut us out. We're your family." But Eliza didn't turn around. She had already made her decision. She wasn't walking back into the life they wanted for her. She was walking forward into the life she had built with Jake and the future she had earned. "Goodbye," she said softly, closing the door behind her. She didn't look back. Eliza's decision to leave her family behind was difficult, but it was also freeing. As the days turned into weeks, she began to settle into her new life with Jake, finding solace in the simplicity they had chosen for themselves. They may not have had much, just a small apartment and modest belongings, but they had each other, and that was enough. They laughed, they loved, and they built their life from scratch. It was hard work, but it was real. Jake's welding career had begun to take off, and with each new project, they moved one step closer to the life they had dreamed of. He worked long hours, but he always made time for Eliza, whether it was cooking, dinner together, or just watching old movies on a Friday night. It was in these small moments that Eliza realized she had everything she needed. Jake was the anchor she had always longed for, and with him, she felt truly seen. But as their life began to stabilize, the past had a way of creeping back in. Eliza had kept her distance from her family, avoiding the calls and letters that came in the months after she walked away. She had no intention of returning to the life they had forced her into, and she had no desire to relive the suffocating expectations. But when a news story broke, it rocked her world in a way she hadn't expected. Her father's name was splashed across every headline, a scandal involving financial mismanagement, shady business dealings, and corruption. The man who had once stood as a pillar of the community was now a symbol of everything Eliza had tried to escape. The proud father, the one who had always expected perfection, was now a disgraced figure, and Eliza was left wondering if it was some sort of karmic justice. She sat on the couch, staring at the screen, the news anchor's voice blurring in the background. Jake came up behind her and placed a hand on her shoulder, sensing the shift in her mood. "Eliza," he said softly. "What's going on?" Eliza's hand trembled as she shut off the television. "It's my father. He's been caught up in some scandal. He's been lying, cheating, doing things behind people's backs." Jake's voice was low and steady. I'm sorry, Eliza, but you know you don't have to get involved in this. You don't owe him anything. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and disbelief. You don't understand, Jake. This is everything I tried to avoid. I've worked so hard to build something real, and now I'm seeing the person who forced me into that life unravel. It felt like the final piece of her past had shattered before her eyes, confirming every suspicion she had carried for years. Her father, the man who had demanded perfection from her, had fallen so far from the pedestal she had once placed him on. Do you want to do something about it? Jake asked, his tone practical, like he was already planning the next step. Eliza sat back against the couch, her mind racing. She had no desire to rush back into that world, but at the same time, a part of her felt a strange sense of satisfaction. This was the justice she had always wanted, the comeuppance for everything her family had put her through. And yet, despite the satisfaction, there was a bitterness that lingered. She wasn't sure if she was ready to forgive, but she knew one thing for certain. She didn't owe them anything. The phone rang on the coffee table, breaking her from her thoughts. It was her mother. Eliza stared at the phone for a long moment before picking it up, her heart racing in her chest. Eliza! Her mother's voice was soft, almost pleading. I didn't know how to reach you. Please, you have to come home. We need you. Your father. He's a mess. He needs help. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She could hear the desperation in her mother's voice, but it didn't soften the anger that was boiling inside her. I'm not coming back. Mom, Eliza replied, her voice steady but firm. I've built my life without you. I'm not going to be your savior, and I'm not going to fix what's broken. You did that yourself. There was silence on the other end of the line. Her mother's soft sobs echoed through the receiver, but Eliza didn't flinch. She had heard it all before, the apologies, the promises of change, the desperation. But none of it mattered. It had never mattered to her family that she was her own person, with her own dreams and her own life. They had always treated her as a tool to fulfill their vision of perfection. I'm sorry, Mom, Eliza said, her voice quiet but unwavering. I have my own family now, and that's where I belong. With that, she hung up the phone. Eliza leaned back, a sense of finality settling over her. It wasn't forgiveness. She felt it was freedom. Freedom from a family who had never truly understood her. Freedom from a past that had held her captive for so long. As Jake returned to the living room, she looked at him and smiled. They didn't need to look back anymore. Are you okay? Jake asked, his eyes soft with concern. Eliza nodded, her heart light for the first time in years. Yeah, I'm more than okay. She didn't need her parents. She didn't need anyone who didn't see her for who she truly was. All she needed was the life they had built, a life of freedom, love, and truth. And for the first time, Eliza felt truly at peace. Eliza had found peace in the life she and Jake had created together. With each passing day, their bond grew stronger. They had faced challenges, both personal and financial, but they had weathered them together. Jake's career in welding was thriving, and they had finally begun to feel secure. Eliza had found a sense of belonging she had never experienced before, and it wasn't in her family's expectations or the ideal life they had demanded. It was in the simplicity of their small home, the warmth of Jake's smile, and the promise of a future built on their own terms. One evening, as they sat together on their porch, watching the sunset, Jake turned to Eliza, his eyes filled with affection. You know, I've been thinking a lot about the future, about us. Eliza smiled, running her fingers through his hair. What about it? I think it's time to take the next step. We've been through so much, and I want to build a life with you, one that's even more permanent. I want to be your family. Always. Eliza's heart skipped a beat. She had never thought much about marriage before, at least not in the traditional sense. But with Jake, things were different. He wasn't part of her past, part of the world that had tried to shape her into someone she wasn't. He was the person who saw her, truly saw her, for all that she was. "I think I want that too," she replied softly, her voice steady and sure. "But I don't need a ceremony or a title. I just need you." Jake chuckled, his hand resting on hers. "Good, because I'm not asking for a big wedding or anything like that. Just you, me, and a future we can build together." As the days passed, Eliza realized that this was the life she had always wanted. Not one of grandeur or expectations, but one of simple love and shared dreams. The past, with all its pain and struggles, had shaped her into the person she was today, but it no longer defined her. She had built something real with Jake, and that was enough. The news about her father's scandal had faded into the background, a distant memory now. The family that had once held so much power over her life was no longer a part of her reality. They had tried to pull her back into their world, but Eliza had refused to return. She had chosen her own path, and it had led her to Jake, and to a life of true freedom. As the months went by, their love deepened, and when Eliza found out she was pregnant, it was the final piece of their puzzle. Their family, their life, was complete. In the quiet moments, as she lay next to Jake, Eliza often thought about the journey that had brought her here. It had been a long road, filled with twists and turns, but it had led her to the only place she truly wanted to be. True freedom wasn't just about escaping her family's grip. It was about the choices she made to create a life that was hers, and hers alone. It was about the love she shared with Jake and the family they were building together. And as they sat together that evening, watching the stars appear in the sky, Eliza knew one thing for sure. She had made the right choice. She had chosen a life built on her own terms, and in doing so, she had found everything she had ever wanted. Minnie.